guest today, author Bill Buppert. Um, he is well known for his book, Zero Gov, Limited Government, Unicorns, and Other Mythological Creatures. And also for his website, zerogov.com, an online journal devoted to the total abolition of slavery of the state. It's my pleasure to speak to you today, and I'm just wondering if you can give such a brief summary of what your goals are with Zero Gov, and then, maybe explore a little bit about your background, and what brought you to write this book and develop this website and actually a growing movement, and your current position. How you see this nation and the world moving forward. And, talk about discussion of secession, violence, and, or nonviolence, rather. And, the differences between nullification and seceding. So if you want to start, just kind of a brief outline on Zero Gov and your book, Limited Government. I love this title, Unicorns and Other Mythological Creatures. It's really wonderful.
Well, I am I'm what most would refer to as an anarcho-capitalist, but I like to use the term abolitionist because basically what I'm trying to do is inspire a worldview in which we have a world not without rules, but a world without rulers, where there are three pillars that are recognized. Number one would be our self-ownership cannot be breached without our own consent as individuals. Number two, if we sign on the contracts, we will abide by those contracts. And number four, we are opposed to all initiated violence through force or fraud. And I think with those three pillars in the formation of a society, from that can emanate the rule set, the behavior, the virtue, and the mores that would form a more nonviolent and peaceful existence for humanity.
These are very lofty goals. I'd like you to repeat the three pillars again so that the audience can...
Those three pillars are self-ownership, cannot be breached without the consent of the individual. Contracts, when signed onto between contracting parties, have to be true. And the third one, and it may be the most important, would be that no violence that is initiated through force or fraud, no aggression initiated through force or fraud would be tolerated.
Wow, there's a lot there to cover.
There is.
Well, before I start looking at these particular points and further into where you are now in the future, can you tell us where you come from? How did you? What brought you to this point? A little bit about your background. Where did you grow up? What influences pushed you in this direction?
Well, I grew up in both Florida and North Carolina, and then at the age of 18, I entered the U.S. military, and I was a military nomad for almost a quarter century after that. I am a retired U.S. Army officer, and since that time, I retired and stopped working for almost 4 years. I re-entered the workforce in 2007, and I've been working since then so I can make sure that all my taxes are paid, because otherwise I wouldn't be a loyal serf now, would I? And it is actually, I've been a libertarian for a long time, probably 2 decades plus, but it was my oldest son, who is now 24, who brought me across the Rubicon, as it were, and showed me a stateless society is the society we should aim for. And the point that he made, and of course I give him credit for this, is the very subtitle of my book. There is no historical precedent, antecedent example that anybody can show me of a limited government remaining limited.
Well, it's true. It's very true. All empires.
Yes. Yeah, empires, large and small. And yes, absolutely. And I think in the end what we discover with our political classes, as it were, and I consider myself apolitical, and we can talk about that a while.
Yeah.
But I look at this not as a political enterprise, but a philosophical enterprise. Is that psychopaths and sociopaths seem to be the ones who people, the upper ranks, of political society. They seem to be the ones who gravitate to rule, because for every righteous ruler like a Cincinnatus or a righteous leader like Robert E. Lee, you have hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands, of very unvirtuous, mean-spirited, and frankly, awful people who have lost their moral compass and will do absolutely anything to include murdering others through civil society or violence. And that's their sine qua non. That's what makes them tick. That's their gravity is initiating force and violence against others. And of course, when we examine that, that's what our present societies are around the planet and have been for the longest time. You know, I consider, you see in the banner on my blog, ZeroGov.com, you'll see a name there called Wilberforce. Wilberforce is an inspiration to me. William Wilberforce was the British parliamentarian in the late 18th century and early 19th century who stood in the aisles, and he was jeered from both sides because he made a very simple statement, to paraphrase. He says the ownership of slaves and the ownership of human beings is immoral and execrable and wrong, and he was laughed out of the parliamentary building because of that statement. Because everybody there around him knew that East and West, globally, for 5 millennia, the ownership of other human beings was the way the world worked.
Yeah, isn't that something?
It is.
It's astounding when you think of the history of the world, what a short period of time. I mean, really, one could say just the last 150 years that people have been given freedom or allowed to. I mean, there are probably little spots here and there where people felt that they could but, yeah, and usually that followed by a lot of chaos, like the bubonic plague.
Sure, and I would submit to you that we're not free. I mean, this is the land of the free and home of the brave, and all the other patriotic bunting and the bad patriotic music and such. But when you strip it all back, we are not a free people, because the cops, who number in the million plus in our country alone, if you violate a law that they are assigned to enforce, then they will fine you, kidnap you, cage you, maim you, or kill you, depending on your level of compliance, for even the most banal of offenses. I mean, there's a difference between laws that are malum prohibitum, which are laws that the government says, we don't want you smoking certain vegetation because the way it alters your consciousness offends us for some reason. Well, there is malum per se, where we know it's wrong, such as rape, crimes against property, murder. And murder, I would tell you, people say, well, Bill, what's the difference in killing and murder because I'm not a pacifist? Murder begins where self-defense ends. That's the simplest explanation I can give for that. I mean, in the Bible, I'm not a Christian, but in the Bible, it's hard to beat the Ten Commandments for me. And Immanuel Kant gave us a categorical imperative that was a secular version, I think, of the Ten Commandments. But the Ten Commandments are very clear that thou shalt not murder, not thou shalt not kill, because you and I both have the right to defend ourselves.
Yeah. I understand it. And your point about not being free and not actually ever being free is poignant because that fight is still continuing, even though we have this thought in our mind that we're free. There are many traps. Vigilance is forever, and I think we're satisfied with the freeing of the slaves and the women given the right to vote child labor, and sort of a progression that we've accepted, but we kind of stopped here, so we stopped here. And that progression slow down or stop, and we're falling back into those old habits,
You know, I think you're right. And democracy is no panacea. And for women to get suffrage, you know, believe them. I'm glad that they can participate. Especially if you go to
Wait, I'm losing you a second. Sorry. Are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, no. Yeah, you were just kind of breaking up there. Okay, so you were saying about women's suffrage.
Right. So women get a chance to cast a vote, but essentially from the local to the national level, you are participating in the serial killer beauty contest. What you're saying is, I'm going to vote for the lesser of two evils, which and I'm going to vote for the guy who killed 14 people instead of 17. Well, guess what? The moral and virtuous thing to do is to vote at all because they are part of the system, and there's no blood on their hands.
Well, you know, that's an argument that I've heard a lot of people make on both sides. You know, to do nothing would be consent.
Did you say both sides? What do you mean by both sides?
Well, when I say both sides, I mean those who do not want to vote, and do not want to participate in the system, and those who are in the system and say, well, you know, even if you vote for a third party, you know, you're not allowing mandates. You're saying, no, I don't agree with, you know, the status quo. Whereas the point of view of those who believe you should vote, especially those who do not vote, that what you're doing by not participating is sensitive to the status quo. By not participating and saying no, and not being
I don't know if to me that's almost like saying that, and please excuse me for being coarse, Liza, but if you don't participate in a gang rape, then what you're doing is you're advocating that. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. You know, if I should not pick up a gun and fire into another human being, people say, well, you're not doing your part. Well, they're right. I'm not going to do my part in that fashion. I refuse to. Because I'll tell you what, the most powerful marker of freedom we have as human beings is the right to opt out and to refuse. When you strip it all away, the most powerful marker of freedom is refusal and the ability to opt out. For instance, we don't. For instance, there are those on the left and right. I happen to be extraordinarily anti-war orientation. I don't like tax support the war machine. I know there's a lot of folks on the left, and I don't consider myself as one. I know there's a lot of folks on the left who felt that way in 2008, but all of a sudden, a lot of those folks on the left, since their man is in the awful office, I spell that O-F-F-A-L, the awful office, they're very silent on this huge warfare welfare state that Bush and Obama have created over the past, well, it's coming on 12 years now. There's projections to them about him expanding this war and attacking to Yemen, to Pakistan, to Libya, to Syria, and virtually making war on them. Why aren't they in the streets? I'll tell you why they're not in the streets is because they have the power.
That's my question. Objection to Obama and the Democrats is, you know, you were out there when Bush was bombing. Obama's bombing and it doesn't go to the Northern County. It's like it's okay. How, you know, it's kind of a phony baloney party. And that, you know, again, this is where my politics kind of goes in the sense that, well, I'm not going to consent to, you know, certainly not to the Republicans, and certainly not to the Democrats, and they're being such hypocrites. So that's where, you know, I lean towards the third party. And most, especially towards, you know, a party or an individual, really, that stands for no war. And so I supported Ron Paul when he was making his run. And, you know, and I saw how they undermined his role. And even though I actually did advocate for that later, you know, I'm leaning with the dream just to stand up and, you know, show them, put the mirror on the Democrats, because where have we been?
Sure.
say, you get this, this is not the scientific study. Well, I think it's still done. And you say, well, what is it? What definition?
Well, I have to tell you that I come to the conclusion, Liza, that there is no political solution. Because whatever political solution you adopt, it's more of the same. Because what you do with a political solution is that you advocate for government. By advocating for government in the state, you're asking for an end at the expense of others, and can only exist when it initiates violence. It cannot exist if it can't do either of those things.
All right, so let's take the next level.
Certainly.
You have point of view to not participate with how does discussion or nullification work and with what we have? We're talking
Well, let me put it in these terms. There are folks like myself who have a very philosophical bent, who will sit on the sidelines, and we're not godlike or no better than anybody else, but we've just decided to take ourselves out of that equation and say, there is an ideal for us to aspire to, and here's what that aspiration looks like. As far as how we get there, I don't have the total roadmap, but what I do know is that the longer we do the same thing, the longer we're going to continue this long legacy we have that's thousands of years long, where we erect and, in essence, advocate these murderous entities called the state. Here's an interesting number for you. Can you guess, Liza, in the 20th century, outside of warfare, how many people governments destroyed? How many corpses were stacked up outside of warfare in the 20th century? We're talking about China, we're talking about Cuba, we're talking about the USSR, we're talking about what the National Socialists did in Germany, we're talking about all that stuff. The number, according to R.J. Rummel, go ahead and take a guess if you wish. Well, not 265 million.
265 million?
That's the estimate, yes.
Really?
Oh, sure. You know what? And I think you're onto something there when you say that. And this is, remember, this is effects outside of warfare. This is outside of the corpses stacked between warring states. You know, when the National Socialists took on the Communists, between the Soviet Union and Germany, and when we got involved in World War II and World War I, the Vietnam War, and all of that. I mean, there are estimates that we have sentenced 45 million people to death just with U.S. policies in warfare since 1945. So we're certainly not innocent of that. I mean, we're a country that in 1893 started to annex Hawaii, and we visited all kinds of brief on the Hawaiian Islands. Then in 1898 to 1902, we're in the Philippines. And there was one general officer serving in the U.S. Army at the time on one of the islands in the Philippine archipelago who said that any male over the age of 10 could be shot on sight if you wish. Now, mind you, fast forward to today, and what we discovered is that Glenn Greenwald did a really interesting piece where he said that any males over the age of 18 or 21 who are killed by our robot killers, our drones, overseas, are going to be listed as militants, even if they're cobblers, couriers, working at a mall, or at a wedding party. If they're males over 21, they're going to be called whatever they are. Well, it's sick. Yeah, it really is psychopathic.
Wonder if we're on Earth is expelling some sort of hormone that's making us kill each other in order to reduce the population to survive.
Well, if it is, it's doing a good job.
Yeah, it seems that the numbers keep growing for this psychopathic behavior. And it scares me. And I don't know really what to do. And I thought, like the system's not working, and the only option we have we're going to try and live a moral and free life and set the model, set the true model for the rest of the nation. And that's as far as I've gone.
I agree with you because you and I spoke earlier before this. Excuse me. And we had talked about the fact that maybe there should be 5,000 states or 50,000 states. Or, you know, if we have to start to decentralize, evolve, and make smaller and smaller states until state finally disappears, maybe that's the time to do so. I'm certain, I do know that there is no reason whatsoever for Phoenix, Arizona, Boise, the state of Minnesota, or the state of California has to be a part of the federal government. There's no, the only logic, of course, for that is the fact that if they attempt to do that, men with guns will come and they will find you, kidnap you, hit you, maim you, or kill you. I mean, that's the way the government operates, that kind of almost chain of lethality that they practice to make us obey.
Yeah, there's no place else to explore, really, on the planet. You know, it's as the pilgrims, you know, left for their, you know, freedom to practice their religion.
Well, I will tell you, though, there are pockets, Isa. There's a place called Zomia, which is a 2.5 million square kilometer massif in Southeast Asia that encompasses parts of the nations of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and other parts of Southeast Asia, in which people have fled into the hills and mountains to avoid the sort of like the Appalachians in the 1930s here.
Yeah, you were just breaking up a little bit. I wanted to get that across. So in Southeast Asia, in these hills that are much like the Appalachians, people are going there to escape, and that, I lost you there. They're going there.
They're escaping the state. It's called Zomia. It's a 2.5 million square mile massif in Southeast Asia. People, XOMIA. Yeah.
And now, are these people from all over the world, or is it just locals?
No, it's just locals there, because of course, you and I, if we wish to, we could get on a sailboat and go in international waters, and like the Steady project that Patrick Freeman is pioneering, he's trying to make it so that you can have floating enclaves or cities that are out in international waters that are out of the grasp of nations, as it were.
But, you know, and I think about this woman, and immediately I start thinking of Tibet. How hard would it be for China to actually just walk in to Burma and say, okay, we're taking it over? And they're pretty brutal, too, when it comes to, you know, collecting territory.
Well, I have to tell you that there's something that I call Hubert's Law of Stratigraphy, and that's this. It's a rifle culture with a lot of men and women with rifles who know how to use them, and they live in mountainous terrain. They can very rarely be militarily defeated. For instance, that's one of the explanations for what's happening in Afghanistan.
And I guess that makes sense with Switzerland as well.
Absolutely. You know, Switzerland is a grand example. There are many books out there, Stephen Albert's book among them, where he talks about how they were able to defend themselves. This tiny little nation state, right in the midst of World War II, remaining neutral, and pretty much taking the Wehrmacht and the German war machine and put them back on their heels, and giving them a very severe disincentive to even embark on an invasion of Switzerland. They never did so.
No, they didn't. But, you know, there's always those underpinnings where they say, well, they were able to cut steel, you know, and they hid some of their wealth in exchange for, you know, less conflict.
You know what? And I'll bet politicians participated in that, so I'll give you that. Yes, I have no doubt of it. Yeah.
But that's interesting. That might be a worthwhile to do a whole show on this Zomia. I think that'd be so fascinating.
Sure. As a matter of fact, the guy who published the book, and I'll send you an email about it. And Liza, maybe what you can do is get in touch with him, and he may even come on your show.
I find that fascinating. It's like that other one that's off the British Isle. It's an old rig. I don't know if it's called SeaWorld or Seascape or something.
And that's what's referred to as a micronation.
Yeah.
Yeah, even though it's not recognized by the United Nations.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then as you brought up the gentleman, was it PayPal or Amazon? I can't remember. Who once developed this nanoman.
Well, I know that Peter Thiel is interested in it, but Patrick Friedman, who is the son of David Friedman, who is the son of Milton Friedman, is the one who's head of the Seasteading Project. But Milton Friedman is not one of my heroes at all, because he's the one who gave us the withholding tax in the U.S. government, where the tax is actually taken out of our paychecks. And he was also one of the authors who recommended to FDR what became the highest marginal income tax rate in the United States during its history, which was 94%.
There's so much to know, so much to learn for people to comprehend, and especially when there's so much given to them to occupy their minds with television, internet.
Oh, you know what? Liza, you're touching on one of my pet peeves, because I think that our electronic tethering is destroying us as a human civilization. Because think of it this way. Here we are, right here, right now, with the maximum horizontal and vertical access to all the information the world has ever seen. There's no match. There's nothing that compares to the information that we can grab today and bring together through interdisciplinary studies. Whatever you want to do, if you want to be a member of a 1956 Frozen Dinner Association, I'll bet you can find people who can show. You name something that, as wacky as that sounds, or maybe there are people out there who are interested in string theory and physics, or they're interested in Hawking versus some of his. All this stuff is there. What are people spending their glorious time with, as far as their time investment? People Magazine, Us Magazine, dithering on the computer, noodling about, their bowel movements and eating bacon. Yeah.
It's astounding. You have all this at your fingertips, what I mean? It's awesome, and at the same time, you see how the majority of it is being used. It almost seems criminal, and it makes you want to leave society. Makes you want to just go out, and that brings us, which I think sort of brings us into this idea of nullification or secession. Now, I'd like to talk about both of those points.
Certainly.
And if you find differences, and I looked them up, so I want to be clear on their definitions. And I got the impression nullification must come before secession, or secession must come before nullification. So secession is the legal act of withdrawing, and nullification is after the fact. That's what Webster came. So I'd like to express some clarity on those terms, and then your vision of how we're moving that direction, or are we moving that direction?
Okay, nullification. Now, I think I have a slight disagreement with your definition, unless I read it wrong. And that's this. Tom Woods, who was probably the most eloquent advocate of nullification in the U.S. right now, probably one of the most eloquent advocates of freedom and liberty. He works for the Von Mises Institute out of Auburn, Alabama, and you can YouTube his name. And he's a very entertaining speaker. He wrote a book on nullification. What nullification basically means is that if there is a state in the Union, and there's 11 of them right now, who says we are not participating in Obamacare, as a for instance, they'll stand up and say, you know what, within the borders of our state, we're no longer going to recognize that federal law as having any standing whatsoever within our borders, and we will not enforce it. And those federal agents or federal law enforcement officers within our borders who seek to enforce that intervention in state law will be arrested. To me, that's the way I see nullification working. And you can name your poison. For instance, I'm a firearms guy, and a lot of us are fed up with the BATFE, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and the overweening federal regulation that's imposed on all the states. Montana, Wyoming, and Arizona is entertaining this, the Firearms Freedoms Act, where if a gun is produced in the state within state lines, is purchased within state lines, that all federal regulations for guns have no power whatsoever within state borders. That's another form of nullification. I think nullification can usher in secession. Secession secession is not a four-letter word. Secession is something that is the natural cycle of how nation-states evolve over time. After all, who did we secede from in 1775 when we started our formal divorce proceedings from the United Kingdom? The Crown. So, I mean, our entire country is based on that. And there's a reason why in 1860 and 1861 in the Yankee Congress during the War of Northern Aggression, there was a concerted effort to insert an amendment in the Constitution at the time forbidding secession. Well, why would you have to insert an amendment forbidding secession? Well, the reason you'd have to do that is because most people had a consensus that secession was a perfect right of the states to do. And even Lincoln advocated for secession in 1848. And you spoke of an earlier instance when we spoke on the phone earlier where you were quoting Thomas Jefferson, where he was saying that, states, cities, counties, you know what, I don't care how large or small the enclave, we should always have that right to secession. And it sort of echoes what I said earlier about the ultimate liberty is refusal and opting out. If you can't refuse something and you can't opt out, you're not free.
I agree. I agree absolutely with you. I mean, from every way you look at that idea and that statement, it is there's no way out of it because you are not free if you do not have the option to leave, and because only slaves are kept. They're held against their will.
Well, I would tell you that Lincoln put us all on the plantation in 1865, Mike.
Well, I know a lot of people feel that way, and whenever you bring up the word secession, well, somebody starts killing each other, and that worked out really well, didn't it? Because, all those people died and so forth. Well, there's that excuse, that fear, but at the same time, there was something that was fought in that battle, and it wasn't the liberty of the state. It was to move in a different direction, away from what the founders originally expressed. And so,
now, mind you, Liza, I'm a constitutional skeptic, right?
oh, you did mention that. Yeah.
I am. I think the Constitution probably one of the most nefarious and successful engines for big government ever produced in human history.
Okay, so you want to give a little brief on why you believe that?
Certainly.
That's a conversation here.
It is.
Why?
And we could do that some other time. Well, okay, what brought me to that conclusion is that for the longest time, I drank the constitutional Kool-Aid. And my son sort of forced me to start questioning everything, questioning all authority and such. So I did some philosophical drilling, and I asked myself, let me get this straight. So the Constitution is a document that enhances human freedom and liberty. Got it. That was the promise made. Since that time, what has happened? Well, you can see what's happened. You can see that America has metastasized into probably one of the most lethal military machines that there's ever been on Earth since the Roman legions, or maybe since the Mongols. It's also turned into a machine that puts almost 4 times as many people on parole, probation, and behind bars than the peak gulag population of criminal or political prisoners under Stalin in 1953. We have the highest...
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I was just...
Oh, that's quite all right.
So how do you come to the conclusion that the Constitution brought us to where we are now?
Well, I'll tell you why. Because the whole idea, and one has to read both the Federalists. The Federalists are held up as these these ideal men who postulated freedom. And I would submit to you that they took second place when it came to that. It was the anti-federalists who were the ones who were postulating a devolved, decentralized, Articles of Confederation style concept, where if a state didn't want to participate in something that the national entity wanted them to, they could simply hold up their hand and say, nope, we ain't doing that. But what George Washington and Alexander Hamilton wanted to do was put a gun in the hands of the national state and make it so that they could have this federal government apparatus that could reach over state lines, reach into the pockets of consumers and taxpayers, and take the money as they wish, despite what the wishes of that state or smaller political subsidiary would be. And then we look at this. In 1791, Rhode Island, which was called Rogue Island, had the only plebiscite for the Constitution. And the Constitution lost 10-1 in that voting plebiscite. Now, the reason that happened is because a mere 7 years earlier at the Treaty of Paris, where 13 nation-states met with the United Kingdom and said, we are not going to practice war anymore, we're divorced, we're both going to go in peace. We 13 nation-states, you United Kingdom, we're separated from you. So we'll look at you across the Atlantic, we'll look across at each other from the Atlantic, but we'll no longer point weapons at each other because the Treaty of Paris has established a surrender and a peace. So that was done. And then what happened in 1791, the people of Rhode Island, the only state of the 13 that ratified the Constitution that allowed the people to vote instead of allowing a bifurcated or unitary executive mechanism within those states like a Congress, like a state Congress or such. 10-1 because they said, wait, we spent all that blood and treasure for 8 years to get a divorce from the United Kingdom, and you want to visit that on us again? You want to export from London and the Crown that very kind of totalitarian mechanism and park it on top of us? And then in 1794, Washington, at the head of a 13,000-man army, national army, marches on tax evaders in Pennsylvania during the Whiskey Rebellion. And in 1798, a mere 7 years after the Constitution is ratified, we have the federal government saying, if you criticize the federal government, we will put you in jail or worse, because we don't like what you're saying, we don't like what you're thinking. And then, of course, we go through the whole sorry travesty of federal regulatory behavior and warlike behavior around the planet and against us as human beings and citizens in the U.S. in the 19th and 20th century. And you find, well, if the Constitution is such a guarantor of freedom, why are we living in such totalitarian misery? And like Sanders Spooner put it best when he said, either the Constitution meant to do this, or it has no power to stop it. Therefore, it is unfit to exist.
Well,
so in a nutshell, that's it. But we could talk about this. We could talk about this a lot longer, and I'd love to do that at some time if you're interested.
yeah, no. There's a lot of things that we're going to talk about and pick up on because this is going deeper into all of these issues. It needs to be talked about.
Because sacred cows make the best burgers.
Wonderful. When you were talking about Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, I started thinking about the Quakers, and but that's another. That'll take us.
It's funny. A friend of mine, Ben Stone, runs badquaker.com, and I talked to Ben because I said, Ben, what does that mean, a bad Quaker? He said, I really dig what the Quakers have to say, except their attitude towards guns. I love guns, except I agree with everything else, so that makes me a bad Quaker.
Well, they got a lot of trouble with these Catholics, so.
And you know what? That's a sure road to extinction in my mind.
Yeah. Well, it's just like Lord of the Flies,
It is.
That probably could take us into another direction, talking about philosophy and evil and good, and where does it come from. But I'm not sure that's something I want to address today, even though I think that would be a really fascinating conversation, and I'd like to hold on to that, in the future.
Sure, but I would say one thing since you brought it up.
Okay.
And I'm here to tell you that what government does is it enables those darkest parts of humanity become manifest and real and physical and visited upon both innocent and guilty alike.
That was the end of part 1 of my interview with Bill Buford. Part 2 will broadcast next week. I also hope to invite him back. I have a number of follow-up questions. If you have questions for my guests, please send them to 3wordsradio@gmail.com. I will be sure to ask. In the meantime, our shows are broadcast at River West Radio and archived on YouTube at 3 Words Radio and at 3wordsradio.org. Remember, these are your airwaves. Support and take good care. This is Eliza Brooks. Thank you for listening.